Greetings. My text this week is from John chapter 8, verses 12 through 30. And I'm focusing specifically on the idea of Jesus as the light being Jesus the judge, and how he talks with the Pharisees in this passage about what it means for him to be the judge. Now, in order to do that, I want to do two things in this video to set up the background. Number one is to look at the context of John chapters 7 and 8. And then number two is to look at what the word judge meant to Jesus and to the early church. And so let's begin with John chapters 7 and 8. Now, this is a difficult section because it does appear that John chapter 7 verse 53 through John chapter 8 verse 11 was not originally part of John's gospel. It is, I think, an authentic story about Jesus. I don't think this is just a made up story, but the story of the woman caught in adultery seems to be a real story that somewhere along the way got tied to John chapter 8 verses 1 through 11. And I think with legitimate reason, and I'll show you why in a little bit. But it doesn't appear that this was the original construction of the book. Instead, what we have is Jesus going to the temple in a feast and sitting in the temple and discussing a whole range of topics with his Pharisee opposition. And that is the story. So if you start in John chapter 7, you'll see that the Pharisees confront Jesus and they stay his opposition through all of chapter 7 and chapter 8 when Jesus finally leaves the temple. Now, that is somewhat important because it means that all of John 7 and 8 is tied together thematically. If we were looking at other elements of this passage, say Jesus testifying about himself and what that means to testify about himself and who his Father is, then the elements of John 7 would probably be more important. But I'm not really covering that, except to say that what the Pharisees are saying is you just speak on your own authority, and Jesus is trying to come back with, if you truly knew God's character, God's heart, what God was about, then you would recognize in me that same character, the same heart, the same concerns. In other words, Jesus is saying the reason that you don't accept my testimony, the reason you don't accept who I am, is because you don't fully understand who God is, and you can't understand my ideas, my ways of looking at things until you fully understand what God is trying to tell you in your scriptures. And so that becomes a conflict point. But for today, we want to talk about Jesus as the judge. And when we talk about Jesus as a judge, we have to ask ourselves not what is our current understanding of being a judge. So today, a judge is somebody who sits above in a court and judges on behalf of the government, whether or not the government is right, or the government is correct in its judgment that a person has done something to offend the government. That's typically how we think of judge, is as a person who sits in authority to judge whether or not, to determine whether or not an individual has done something out of line according to the government standard. Now, what we typically do when we talk about God as judge is we plug God into that role. We say God is the judge, as in God has brought charges against humanity, that humanity has done something, or this particular person has done something to contradict God's standard, and therefore God is holding that person guilty. Because that is, after all, the way that our system works. The prosecutor is essentially saying that the government has found this person guilty of violating our standards, and the judge is there to determine whether or not the prosecutor is correct in saying this person has violated our standards. They are judging whether or not the prosecutor did their job efficiently and effectively. Now, that is not a good analogy for what is going through Jesus's mind when he uses the word judge. He is using the word judge in a much more a much different sense, something that is much more dependent on the Hebrew idea of mashpot, which is a combination of judging, as in sifting, as in deciding which category to put somebody in, combined with somebody who rules. So what this idea means is that God is somebody who sifts out the innocent and then governs them and rules over them. This is the idea behind a lot of passages of judgment in the Old Testament, even ideas where we use other words to translate judgment. I think of Psalm 70 verse 2. We don't translate it judgment, but it is it's kind of this idea of vindicate or come to my aid or rescue. But that is in Hebrew and Greek. That word there is judge. So what we see in Jesus is somebody who his judgment is to preserve the innocent, to keep peace and produce peace, because his reign, his rule is governed by peace. Therefore, his judgment is meant to promote, not just keep peace, not just maintain this idea of non-aggression, but rather to promote harmony and good feelings, goodwill towards in between humans. So Jesus's idea of judgment is not convicting the guilty so much as it is vindicating the innocent. Now, I do know that in this particular passage, Jesus does say to the Pharisees that I have many words concerning judgment about you and how you will be lost in your sins. And this does this gets into kind of where my reflection is going, but it is creating a little bit of a contradiction in that Jesus is using judgment both positively and negatively. And it feeds back to what we looked at last week in John 3. But let's talk about the positive, because I think the reason that the story of the woman caught in adultery was put in front of this passage is in large part because in that story, we get a visual of what Jesus is like as the judge. The woman is brought to Jesus. She has been caught in the act of adultery. That now we don't know to what extent. In other words, we don't know what act she was caught in. We don't know how the Pharisees are defining adultery. We don't know what that means. We can speculate and we can add our own interpretations here, but we don't know what she was doing that they caught her in the act of. But she is brought to Jesus as somebody who is legally guilty. She is somebody who has violated the letter of the law. Now, by our standards and our idea of judge, she would have been found guilty. If they were the prosecutors, the judge would have no choice but to find her guilty of the crime of adultery. And they are asking Jesus, how do you rule on this case? How do you propose that we rule? And you notice what Jesus does and doesn't do. Number one, he does not condemn her according to the letter of the law. He does not push on her a conviction according to just basic right and wrong. Instead, he looks at her and he looks at them and says, you are trying to condemn her based on this action when you are also guilty. In other words, he finds a way to say to them, listen, legally, morally, ethically, you're all guilty of breaking this law, of breaking the law in some way. Now, what he is not doing is just letting her off scot-free. He is not just saying it does not matter, because he will say, go and sin no more. What he is doing, instead of saying to her, you are guilty, therefore here is your punishment, he is saying to them, she might be guilty, and she probably is guilty. But what we are trying to achieve is not a system that is based on guilt and innocence. What we are trying to achieve is a system where people learn to love and respect one another, where they learn to care for one another, build each other up, create this society founded on peace. And what's going to be the best thing for resolving this situation is not me judging her guilty of a crime that deserves death. What is going to be the best is if you guys look into your hearts and say, I too have been there, and I need to respond to this woman accordingly. Now, again, Jesus does not let her off the hook completely, but he looks at the people who are trying to abuse the system and say to them, you're abusing a system to condemn others when you yourselves deserve to be condemned by the same system. And that's wrong. And what we see when we look back at John chapter 5, when we look back at John chapter 3, is Jesus is consistently saying to us that he is the judge. He is the one who has the power to sift between peoples. This is what comes about because he is the person talked about in Daniel chapter 7. This person who combines reign and rule with the rod of iron. So the symbols of the throne and the rod, the symbol of ruling with the symbol of judging. He is the person who combines all of that. Therefore, he has this power, and God has granted him this power, as he will say to the Pharisees in this passage. He and God are united in a unique way. And because of that, he has this power that Daniel 7 gives to the Son of Man. And so Jesus will then say to us in John 3, John 5, and here again in John 8, that his judgment is not based on whether or not people have broken a law. His judgment is not based on what people deserve based on their law, on their standing before the law. His basis of judgment is simply whether or not people follow him, whether or not they are committed to the kind of life that he is committed to. Are people going to live out the kind of life that he is committed to? Are they trying to live a life that loves God and loves others? As he will say in John 13, the only new commandment that Jesus ever gives, love one another as I have loved you. That's the only commandment that he leaves his disciples with. Why? Because he knows that they are going to attempt to love God. They've already shown that. Their entire lives are dedicated to loving God. Now, what they need is to translate that into allowing that love for God to create a society that is built on peace, on justice, on righteousness, and allowing that to bubble up in them and become a new way of living, a new kingdom. And so here we have Jesus, who is the righteous judge, judging not by what is legal or illegal, moral or immoral, judging purely on, does this person attempt to follow me? Does this person want to follow me? Does this person want to walk in my footsteps? And does this person live by the light? Or are they committed to this punitive idea, this selfish idea of the kind of the way the Pharisees are holding on to power and manipulating situations so that they can hold on to power and control. That's where we are this week. I kind of pick up those themes in my reflection, but I hope this helps you a little bit more. If I can be of any help with questions or comments, please let me know. Until we meet again, God bless.